It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, I'm going to talk about the 1979 film The Amityville Horror, directed by Stuart Rosenberg, based on the 1977 novel written by Jay Anson. There's a lot that you can go into about everything that makes up the story of the Amityville Horror. I could talk about Stuart Rosenberg and how his career has some significant titles within it, like Cool Hand Luke. I could talk about our trio of notable actors like James Brolin, Margot Kidder, and Rod Steiger. I could talk about how not only did this one film launch its own line of sequels, but how the word Amityville and its public record of having a supposed haunting leaves that in the public domain to be slapped on an incredible number of movies since about the year 2020. But what I really want to talk about is the use of the concept of based on a true story. The Amityville Horror was undoubtedly a phenomenon in the realm of supernatural and paranormal study and fandom. It's one of the, if not the first, it's certainly one of the most popular pop culture haunting stories that was ever taken particularly seriously by the media. I vaguely remember the story even being examined sometime in the 80s, I think on an episode of 60 Minutes. And if it wasn't that, it was some other news magazine show on TV. But just about every household in the country seemed to have a copy of the 1977 Anson book about the goings-on in the home at 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, New York. It's a big deal, and certainly inspired a lot of people's imagination and interest in the paranormal. So here's the story. On November 13th, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed 6 family members at 112 Ocean Avenue. Supposedly, DeFeo claimed that he could hear his family members plotting against him. This led to a defense of insanity, but that didn't really work. He ultimately was sentenced to a consecutive string of 6 25-year sentences for second-degree murder. About 13 months after his conviction, or about a month after his conviction, but after 13 months following the residence being unoccupied, George and Kathy Lutz moved in with their 3 kids. As the story goes, 28 days later, the Lutzes abandoned their house after reporting a barrage of paranormal happenings that terrified them. But let's talk about the movie itself and then circle back around to the legend of the Amityville Horror. The movie opens with a great shot of the house at 112 Ocean Avenue with red in the background and within the quarter circle windows that give it its famous appearance. Then, after the credits, we go into the early morning of November 13th, 1974, with the DeFeo murders. Later, the police arrive and investigate, and we get some words on screen that explain a mother, a father, and 4 of their children were murdered with no apparent motive. Now, while they were all killed execution style, only the mother was shot in the head. All the others were shot in the torso. I'm not sure if that's quite as important as the time of the killings, which is 3:15 a.m. Many months later, the Lutzes, George and Kathy, arrive to look at the Ocean Avenue property. They're surprised to see how this waterfront property has all this extra land and buildings that come with it. And it's not just that, but the house itself is massive, and it just needs a little bit of work as it's not really been taken care of over the last year. The real estate agent shows them around, but seems a little nervous. And Kathy doesn't think that they have a hope in the world of affording the place. I mean, George owns a small company, or at least co-owns a small company. It doesn't really think that it really doesn't seem like they have the money to do this. But as they go from room to room, we also follow Ronald DeFeo Jr. and how he moved through the house killing his family. The real estate agent does mention that if George and Kathy like anything within the house, it can be included with the price of the house. And the Lutzes are aware of the history of the house. I mean, George is quite clear that houses don't have memories. Just because something awful happened in the house doesn't mean it will again. And as the real estate agent works on the paperwork, she notices flies starting to gather and a cold burst of wind that's blowing through the house, even though the windows and doors are not open. She decides to basically get the hell out of there. And a month later, the Lutzes move in. Right out of the gate, George seems a little gruff. I mean, he's not terribly impressed with the family crucifix that Kathy wants to hang on the wall. Additionally, the Lutzes just got married, but he's adopting Kathy's 3 children from her previous marriage. And the kids still call him George instead of Dad, but at least they're no longer calling him Mr. Lutz anymore. That really bothered him. I do think this kind of informs his character and how he later becomes far more mean and kind of hateful. He doesn't exactly come off as the perfect guy. But anyway, aside from what the real estate agent dealt with, things really start to go south when Father Delaney, played by Rod Steiger, arrives to bless the house, something else that Kathy requested. He begins to sweat profusely as flies begin to swarm in the room that he starts the blessing in, and soon he's overcome with a terrible stench in the house. Then a whispering, disembodied voice demands that he get out. The voice becomes a growl, yelling for Father Delaney to leave, and so he does. When he gets outside, he throws up and leaves without ever seeing the Lutzes. He tries to call later to speak to Kathy, but neither end of the call can hear anything other than static. In fact, the phone even burns Delaney's hands. A few days later, Kathy's aunt, a nun, also has an adverse reaction to being in the house, and she too gets sick and can't stay. Now, things do seem to progress nicely with the people, with the Lutzes moving in and getting comfortable, but not everything is perfect. George complains of a draft despite the house supposedly being well insulated. The basement stairs causes one of the kids to stumble and fall down them. The little girl has nightmares and wants to go home. And dang it, George wakes up every night at 3:15 a.m. By the 4th day, George starts to let his frustrations out on logs with an axe that he's constantly chopping to provide the firewood to keep the place warm. And, he kind of starts to display a shorter fuse for his temper. He's not the only one who is experiencing things. Kathy gets to a point in which she feels as though something is watching her. Amy, the daughter, starts talking to a new imaginary friend named Jody. The toilet also begins to bubble up with a black sludge. The movie basically details the major events that the Lutzes dealt with during their 28-day stay in the house. Those things I just mentioned really begins in the first 4 or 5 days after the Lutzes move in, but things start to take a much steeper decline. George becomes obsessed with heating the house with firewood despite no one else feeling cold. George keeps getting his sleep interrupted at 3:15 a.m., which only continues to degrade his temperament and makes him more and more hostile and abusive. George also can't perform in bed any longer. Kathy begins having horrible nightmares, one of which causes her to wake up screaming that, quote, she was shot in the head. When Father Delaney tries to return to the house, the car that his colleague, Father Bolin, is driving suddenly loses control with the brakes failing and the hood flying up, nearly getting them killed. A large sum of money that was needed to be paid to the caterers of Kathy's brother's wedding goes missing. But the first real act of aggression against someone who is not a priest or a nun comes when a babysitter named Jackie comes in to watch Amy while the other Lutzes are at Kathy's brother's wedding. When she gets Amy ready for bed, an unseen force locks the babysitter in the closet. When Amy is asked why she didn't let Jackie out once the other Lutzes get home, she says Jody wouldn't let her. And when George gets angry, Amy says Jody doesn't like George. And George is not the only member of the family that Jody takes a disliking to. When the two sons tease Amy and try to scare her with a rubber spider, Jody drops a window on one of the boys' hands and holds the window down on it until George is able to force it open again. But the really peculiar thing about this is that despite it hurting the kid pretty badly, no bones were broken. It was almost as if it was just a warning to not mess with Amy. But George's health and mood continues to decline, and he's ignoring his duties at work. The activity in the house continues to escalate, too. One night, the basement door breaks open, and then the front door blows off its hinges on its own. It's as if something came up from the basement and blasted its way through the door to get out. And even the dog has become particularly interested in a part of the basement and starts scratching at the floor in front of a wall that's downstairs. George's business partner, Jeffrey, tries to talk sense into George. The business is failing. But Jeffrey's wife, Carolyn, was already spooked by George's house earlier on, but she begins looking at a book that indicates that the house was built on ground that was cursed. Carolyn then becomes obsessed about the basement of the house, and she seems to be something of a medium, has some sort of psychic ability. And basically the house was built on a piece of land that was used many, many years ago as maybe a place where some satanic stuff happened, but ultimately was also, I think, some place where like some mentally insane people were housed. And within the brick wall that the dog keeps scratching at in the basement, there is a small red room that was bricked off where some of those insane people were left to die. And that's where all this bad juju came from. And one of the spirits possessing the house speaks through Carolyn, who tells the others that they found the passage to hell. Kathy becomes convinced that, the place is haunted or possessed or something. And this isn't helped by the crucifix being found hanging upside down on the wall. And it looks like it may be covered in soot or something black. So Kathy and George try to bless the house themselves, but this doesn't help as their attempts end with Kathy being cursed with boils on her face and hands. In addition, Father Delaney becomes more and more concerned for the Lutzes, and he prays from his pulpit until he is suddenly struck blind and placed into a catatonic state. Kathy investigates the history of the house, and she is settled basically on the house being haunted. And when she eventually looks at the newspaper article surrounding the murder of the DeFeos, she's shocked to see that Ronald DeFeo Jr. is a dead ringer for George Lutz. In fact, it's James Brolin in the newspaper clipping of the arrested Ronald DeFeo Jr. She rushes home and is able to stop George from killing the children with an axe, but during the stormy final night at the house, Kathy comes home and the door closes itself. Jody manifests herself as a giant pig with red eyes. The walls begin to bleed. The dog stays behind to growl at whatever it is that's in the basement. And George has to rescue the dog after falling into some black sludge that's filling up the basement from that red room behind the brick wall. The family finally escape, and the movie tells us that they left without reclaiming any of their personal belongings. They got so far away from the house that they actually now live in an entirely different state. But let's talk about the three things I like about 1979's The Amityville Horror. My first like goes to James Brolin. He never really comes across as an overly friendly person in this. He's stern. In the early scenes, as the Lutzes look at the house and before he's obviously possessed by the house, he seems okay, but there's an important angle that George Lutz never really seems to really say or do anything that makes him seem like an overly decent person. I do have a little bit more to say about that later, but Brolin grows more and more pale, and he always looks pissed off. I mean, he definitely seems like he's losing his mind. And as the movie continues, he spirals badly to the point that he comes across as downright violent and aggressive. It's a good performance. And when the character that is turning into this bad person is a parent, it does create a whole other level of uneasiness. It helps make this movie the classic that it is and helps support the claim that it really is among one of the scariest movies ever made. It almost transcends the haunted house element into an abusive parent and or spouse narrative. It's something that gets a little more attention in the remake too, and makes for a fantastic allegory for when this sort of stuff happens to a family, when someone from the inside begins terrorizing the rest of them. And I do want to go back to what are multiple references to George Lutz and Ronald DeFeo Jr. being very close in appearance, as if one turned into the other, or that they were fated to both have things happen to their families, etc. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, in real life, I suppose they do look somewhat familiar, but if you look at every adult man in the 70s, they all look the same. Hair somewhere between longer than short and downright shaggy, and a bristly beard. Seriously, every grown man in the 70s looked like that. Just, you got to trust me on that. But second, this is a surprisingly quiet movie for being a horror film. Yes, we build toward a climax, but that part that I said about this working as an allegory for a family falling apart due to abuse and violence inside the walls of the home, well, that also comes through in how this movie handles the various scenes of the movie. This isn't so much a plot as much as it is a series of events that happen over the course of 28 days that takes this from a newly formed family to basically everyone being tortured. It doesn't have an overly typical narrative. Instead, it opts to tell the story from within the family. On this day, this happened. On the next day, that happened, and so on and so forth. In addition, there is a scene in which you are given something of an out if you want to think of the story as something other than an actual haunting and possession. George's business partner makes reference that George has gotten in over his head by marrying a woman with a trio of kids, bought a house that he probably couldn't have afforded normally, and even changing his religion. So, as I'll talk about in just a moment, there's even a way to read this whole story of the Lutzes that, they didn't really have a haunting. George just got in over his head. Now, thirdly, man, that house is already kind of creepy looking without this movie or book being written about it. Those quarter circle pie piece shaped windows in the attic are spooky. I mean, in a way, the place looks like it's kind of like a jack-o'-lantern with the window serving as its eyes. I've seen other houses in real life with that same window design at the top of the house, and that serves as windows to the attic. And because of this movie, it really does creep me out, man. I mean, today the house doesn't have those windows anymore, the real house. However, the shape of the house itself on a dark and stormy night would not be something I would want to see or go into. It's one of those kind of Dutch colonial style houses and just by looking at it, you could probably fairly easily conjure up some eerie ghost stories about what goes on inside. It's a great house and maybe the most iconic house in movie history. Certainly in horror history. But I've talked about the movie. I've talked about my usual 3 things I like about it. But I think there's something more that needs to be looked at when it comes to the Amityville Horror. And that's the accuracy and what the story actually was and how the tale plays out in real life. So, here's the thing about the tale around the Amityville Horror, and this might be what the kids these days call a hot take, but I think it's all bullshit. Now, I do think the story of the DeFeo murders and the tale weaved by the Lutzes in cooperation with Jay Anson is compelling stuff. Whenever there's bad juju or history someplace, that seems like a great place to start a haunting story. The eldest kid killing his younger siblings and parents is pretty dark. There were even tales told about how he thought the devil told him to do it and so on and so forth. And also, you can kind of get into some of the additional story around Ronald DeFeo Jr. and how he even comes up with this accomplice to try to kind of ease the sentencing that he had. It's kind of compelling, and even that is conjured up. And it's a great way to start your ghost story. It's a fascinating tale of a true life crime that took place before the Lutzes ever moved into that place. However, I can't seem to quite get away from several things that have either come to light, been widely suspected, or stuff I just cannot discount in the grand story. Let it be known that I only have some knowledge. I'm not going to say I'm anywhere near an expert when it comes to the Amityville horror stuff. So don't come at me asking me how I can discount this or account for that, etc. But the first thing that indicates to me that this might not be entirely truthful, that evil entities tried to possess George and make him kill his wife and kids, is that after leaving the house, neither the Lutzes nor any subsequent occupants of the house ever had any other paranormal things happen. The worst any subsequent people had to deal with were the gawkers who traveled to Amityville to look at the DeFeo murder house because of its popularity from the novel and the movie. Traditionally speaking, if the site or the people inside the site were haunted, one or the other, or both, the place and the people, would continue to be haunted. Then there's the relationships the Lutzes had with a few other folks involved in the whole story. First, we have one of the Lutzes' biggest critics, Stephen Kaplan, a paranormal investigator. Kaplan spotted several differences in each edition of the J. Anson book that indicated to him that it was really nothing more than a well-crafted story that didn't really have any true basis in reality. Not only that, but when he came to investigate the house during the time the Lutzes lived there, there was an immediate falling out when Kaplan said he'd expose any fraud he found. I mean, that seems pretty suspicious, yes? Now, second, speaking of investigators, there was the involvement of Ed and Lorraine Warren. Now, the Warrens enjoyed a great deal of popularity in paranormal circles over the course of their lives. They presented themselves as demonologists, and through a combination of being able to appropriately sell their investigative and medium skills, able to weave a just spooky enough to be true tale, and good old-fashioned religion, they became somewhat famous. Not nearly as famous as they are now, since the Conjuring movies started coming out about 10 years ago. But no one argued that the Warrens weren't affable people who were very courteous and kind, but most anyone looking to be wowed by the supposed scientific proof the Warrens claimed to have of ghosts and demons just simply were not. They weren't really, people looking for that truth they just weren't wowed by what they had. And the concern is they either are superstitious folks with good ghost storytelling skills, or worse, they were actual frauds and hucksters that suckered people wanting to believe this sort of stuff. Personally, I kind of point a little bit more to the latter. I think if the Warrens got involved with a paranormal situation or investigation, it tended to kind of broadcast a little more legitimacy to those who weren't outright skeptics. It was good for business. If they were hucksters, they could convince someone like, say, George and Kathy Lutz to sell a story about a haunted house and keep the story going so they could cash in. But maybe the most compelling pieces of evidence that support my claims come from a couple of different sources. The first piece is that George Lutz might have been in some pretty bad financial straits shortly after buying the Ocean Avenue property. It's kind of brought up a little bit in the movie itself. The large house was certainly discounted, because of its history. But the upkeep, the taxes, all of it might have been too much to bite off for the Lutzes. I think it's possible that Lutz's business was failing, and he was borderline broke as it was. But another piece of evidence that I really think is key for me to think that the Amityville Horror was a well-crafted, spooky, haunted house story comes from maybe the most unexpected place, William Weber. Now, who is William Weber? He was the defense lawyer for none other than Ronald DeFeo Jr. He said that he and the Lutzes came up with the story over many glasses of wine, and what they came up with would be given to Jay Anson as the outline for the novel. Weber first said that in September of 1979 in a story in People magazine, cover dated just 4 days after the release of the movie. Now, despite me thinking the story of the Amityville Horror is a steaming pile of doo-doo, I actually do think it's a compelling story of a haunted house. I don't even have any issue with people who do think the story is true. I mean, there is one piece of evidence that supposedly makes the claim of the house being haunted, and that's a very eerie picture of a child peering around the corner of one of the bedrooms at the top of the stairs. It's some pants-crappingly scary stuff. Still, it's hard to refute how there are several things around the story that makes me think that it's just not true. Regardless whether or not it is true, there is no denying that the Amityville Horror is the quintessential haunted house story, and its influence is still being felt today. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com, but don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, it's Halloween Eve, and that's a perfect time to take a look at a more recent independent entry in horror, and one that fits perfectly with the holiday. Join me as I take a trip to the barn. Until next week, stay spooky.